Welcome back. And in this episode, I'm going to talk to you about what I really truly believe about the Yamashita gold mystery, and I'm going to clarify my stance. There's people been calling me ill-informed. I don't do my research. I don't know what I'm talking about. Basically, in 1986, I went to the Philippines to meet my ex-wife, and we were traveling around, and this is the first time I ever heard of Yamashita's treasure. We were in Fort Santiago. This is where Robert Curtis and McDougal were digging, and Robert Curtis at the time was working with the Philippine government on doing research or trying to locate different Yamashita treasures that he believed he knew where they existed. And there was a cave-in at Fort Santiago. The Philippine government had to acknowledge that they were looking for Yamashita's treasure. And so if we get into it, you'll find out there's a lot of different angles to this whole story. I do believe that the Japanese had gold in the Philippines in the 1940s and the 1950s, just like the Germans did, because the Japanese actually held parts of Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand. And yes, they could have moved everything over to the Philippines to ship to Japan, and it would have been at the ports. When the United States attacked the Philippines in 1943, one of the orders was to blow up all of the ports so the Americans could not land. So if there were gold, it would have been near a port because it'd be easy to transport back to Japan. And I believe maybe there was 20, 30 different locations, which if you add it up, say like 4 or 5 tons each, it'd be about 60 tons of gold, which would be an astronomical amount today. So let's just get into it. I'm going to show you different angles and why I believe it could be true or could not be true. But we first have to go to General Yamashita. So General Yamashita arrived in the Philippines in September of 1944, and he surrendered in September of 1945. So he only had less than 1 year to bury 175 locations. Now, if you think about it, this takes a lot of effort, a lot of coordination. But during his trial, there were 8,000 pages of documents, and not one mentioned gold. If there was a coordinated effort by the Japanese to bury gold, it probably didn't come from Yamashita himself. It probably came from a prince. There was Prince Chichibu, who was in charge of the gold. And there was another prince that gave Ben Valmoris the 175 maps. So if this was happening, it probably would have took 2-3 years to bury all the gold, when it would have been much easier to ship a lot of it back to the U.S., back to Japan. I don't believe Yamashita had a big role in it. One of Yamashita's biggest orders or concerns was looting, stealing, raping the local villages. So Yamashita actually put orders down that if you looted, you were going to be executed. And while he was in the Philippines, I think 7 Japanese soldiers were killed or arrested, tried, and killed for looting. Back to the beginning, before World War II, there was a revolution, a small military revolution uprising against the emperor. Yamashita pleaded leniency to these individuals who went against the emperor. And the emperor did not like Yamashita very much, so he fell out of favor with Hirohito. Then, during the build-up and before the war, Yamashita argued against fighting the United States, which now he fell against Tojo. Later on, during this time, they wanted to get kind of like push him to the side and get rid of him, and he would not get promoted. So they sent him to Germany, met Hitler and Mussolini in 1941. When he returned, they sent him to prepare for the Malaysia invasion. This would have been in 41. The Philippines on December 8th, 1941. It was a few hours from the Japanese invading Pearl Harbor. 15th, 1942, they invaded Malaysia and subsequently attacked Singapore, and like 70 days actually conquered the whole island. And so he was sent to a place called Manchukuo in China in 1942. The Japanese expanded too much, and the Americans started to come back. They sent him to the Philippines in September 26, 1944. He surrendered September 6th. So basically, it was a little less than 1 year, about 24 days less than 1 year. So we'd say almost 11 months. That's all he was in the Philippines. He was tried for crimes that happened in Singapore, crimes that happened in Hong Kong, and so he was killed for crimes against humanity. And he basically said, yeah, I will take the blame. If no one else takes the blame, or if I don't take the blame, someone else is going to take the blame. So he was hung in Los Baños. What happened was, the story begins this. There's a guy named Benvel Morris, and Sterling Seagraves, an author of the Yamamoto Dynasty, the Marcos Dynasty, and the Gold Warriors, actually talked to Benvel Morris and found out that he was given all 175 maps by a prince before the prince left the Philippines, and told him, wait till I come back and then I send someone for the maps. Sterling Seagraves actually has pictures of him with the prince, maybe a picture of him in China. So it winds up that there's a little bit of credibility here. But the problem is, after Marcos got out of power, he became a pointer. Basically what a pointer is someone who walks around the country, and for a fee he will show you where the 175 burial sites are. And Benvel Morris died very poor. He became part of the Leber Group, L-E-B-E-R, and he worked for Ferdinand Marcos along with Robert Curtis and Olaf Johansson. And they reportedly found 12 sites and gave those to Marcos. And if there was 12 sites there, let's just say there's 3 tons of gold. That would be over 36 tons of gold right there Marcos would have had. And that's a substantial. At the end, I'll show you exactly how much money that would equal to. Now, it all starts, again, with Sterling Seagraves. Now, this is one of the basis points. He was a writer in the United States. He discovered a lot of, and he was the first one to write about the golden lily, and so he's very well known in this. So he discovered evidence of CIA involvement in the Philippines after World War II. And like I said, Benvel Morris in China. Actually, a Japanese general went to the Philippines and returned with gold. And he goes and he talks about General Kadama, actually, the guy's name was Yoshio Kadama. He came to the Philippines and he retrieved gold. So he describes all this in his books. He also describes the CIA involvement, and basically the CIA worked with the Black Eagle Trust Fund, or the M Fund, in order to be able to take the gold from the Philippines and be able to use the money from selling the gold to create operations against communism and everything. And Harry Truman was supposed to be involved. General MacArthur was supposed to be involved. Dwight Eisenhower was supposed to be involved. And so it's really a big theory, and spider worms that going everywhere. So it's very, very interesting. Another member of the Leber Group is a man named Robert Curtis. Now, Robert Curtis was a smelter from Sparks, Nevada, and he was invited to the Philippines to help smelt gold. And what he basically did was Marcos invited him to the Philippines and told him that he had a lot of gold from different countries, and he needed to open up a smelting factory to mix all the gold together and make new bars, and this way he could sell it on the international market and no one would know where the bars come from, because there's a lot of people that show bars of gold from like Cambodia, Sumatra. These are the big two right here. So that's what his job was. So he also helped locate gold and everything, and he discovered that he claimed that he helped Marcos find 12 caches of gold. And one day, General Ver, the right-hand man of Marcos, who actually also helped steal gold from the Philippines, took him to the American Veterans Cemetery, and actually had a grave already dug on the ground, and pulled a gun on Robert Curtis's head and threatened to kill him, and said it was an order from Marcos to kill him because he knew way too much. So Robert Curtis somehow talked his way out of being executed at the cemetery and told him that he would help him find more gold. Now, at this point in time, Robert Curtis had physical hold of all 175 maps. So what he did was he went to the store, took some Polaroids, photographed every single map, and then he burnt them all. So all 175 maps have been burnt and eliminated. And so he left the Philippines, and while he was getting on the plane, he was leaving, the immigration customs found out that he was on the plane and called Marcos, or Marcos got wind of it. The plane was stopped. Military officers got on the plane and wanted him off, wanted to search his luggage, and he already said that he's on an American vessel. He's been cleared by customs. There's nothing they can do. And for some reason, they believed him, and they walked off the plane. And so he went back to the United States. After Marcos was posed and got out of office, he came back to the Philippines, helped the Philippine government look for gold. To my knowledge, they've never found it, or at least never have acknowledged it, and Robert Curtis has never really officially stated it. However, he helped the guy, his name's McDougal. He was a former Green Beret, and he told him that there was gold in Fort Santiago. Now, this is the one that I was at, personally, and they were looking for gold in Fort Santiago. McDougal says he never found gold. All the time he's in the Philippines, he never found 1 ounce of gold. However, Robert Curtis says McDougal found 1,500 ounces of gold, or 1,500 pounds of gold, or something to that effect, a staggering amount. McDougal says none. Curtis says he found a lot. He was actually convicted of fraud in the Philippines, or had fraud charges brought up among the Philippines, and he left, and I do not believe he came back. A few years later, Roger Rojas wound up suing the Marcos administration for the theft of the Golden Buddha and 1,800 bars of gold, which came out to be about 6 tons of gold. After each bar weighs like 30 pounds. It was between 3 to 6 tons of gold. And so Robert Curtis actually testified against it and was really damning against it. There's another guy named Ken Cheatham, who was a military officer that came there to look at the statue, and he's the one that has all the photos. And the photos were around the world. They used those photos. But it winds up that Curtis really had a lot of damning things to say during the trial about how Marcos found these 12 sites and everything. And so it winds up that Marcos was investigated by the Golden Buddha lawyers in order to find out where Marcos got his money and where Marcos put his money. And there was an operation called Operation Big Bird, which was working with the Golden Buddha, because they really wanted to know how much money Marcos had, where it was, and how he got it. Marcos was a dictator of the Philippines from 1968 to 1986. His base salary was $5,000 a year, and when he left the Philippines, he was worth $10 billion. Now, he's never ever stated that, or he's always stated or maintained, the family's always stated and maintained that he made money through gold trading, which is true. That's what they found out. But they also found out some other stuff on Marcos. He became president in 1968. He started wiring money to bank accounts outside of the country in 1970. So in 1970, he claimed that he was getting money from Yamashita's treasure. Now, one thing that he may have said this is because he was stealing money from the National Treasury in order to say, oh, I'm stealing money from the National Treasury. Hey, I'm making $5,000, but I can open up a bank account for $150,000. You need to have an excuse where are you getting that money from. So this is where he started saying, I got the money from the Yamashita's treasure. In order to have $10 billion at $800 an ounce, he would have had to have stolen 390 tons. 390 tons. Now, Olaf Johansson, the psychic, said Marcos had over 1,500 tons of gold, which, after you look at some of the bank accounts, it's not 10 billion. It was like 20, 30, 40 billion dollars. So that still would have been over 1,000 tons of gold. But during the revolution in the Philippines, it was reported that the USS Eisenhower came to the Philippines and removed 11 tons of gold. And before he left in December to March, he wired out of the country over $100 million. And he left the country $27 billion in debt. They couldn't even make payments on their national debt. So basically, they were bankrupt. I mean, there was not even $1 to send out of the country. The United States was going to give the Philippines $400 million a year in order to help them out, and plus aid from the U.S. to the Philippines. But it winds up that the Philippine Senate wanted $1 billion a year instead of $400 million. And so the Philippine Senate wanted to play games with Russia and try to kick the United States out and try to see if the Russians would pay more money to come into the Philippines, because Russia was in Cameron Bay in Vietnam, and that was getting old, and they wanted out. But Mount Pinatubo blew, and it destroyed the Clark Air Base, and all the military bases left. And so the Russians did not want to come in, so the Philippines basically lost $400 million. Like I said, Olaf Johansson go over to Roger Rojas, and this is the only verified finding of any treasure in the Philippines. Now, they had like a 870-pound gold Buddha statue, and the head came off. There was loose diamonds inside, and he said he found something like 1,800 bars of gold. Marcos had him arrested, thrown in jail for gun possession, and he was in and out of prison for like 10 years until Marcos found the bars of gold. And the good thing on Roger Rojas' side is, like I said, Ken Cheatham took pictures of this Buddha statue, sent it to the United States, some treasure hunting people, and then they turned around and put it in, made it national news. So it wound up being international news. And the international press came to Baguio to see the golden Buddha statue. And Roger Rojas said, no, it was stolen from Marcos. And so now the press is asking Marcos, where's this Buddha statue? So Marcos gave him a fake Buddha statue, told him to come to the city hall and claim it as real. And then he'll give him $250,000 and call it quits. Well, Rojas refused to do it, and the opposition senators took him under their wings. He basically went into hiding, and then he was caught, captured, escaped, thrown in jail for 3 years. And finally, when he got out, that's when Marcos discovered where the bars of gold were. And he sued Marcos in Hawaii for $22 billion and won the $22 billion, but it was lowered down, and then it was negotiated to a lower fee or payout from the Marcos estate, but Marcos estate has never paid a dollar. So the Philippine Revolution happened in spring of 1986, and basically a lot of generals turned on Marcos. And some of these generals were part of the group called the Rolex 12, which one of them was the Vice President Ramos, who became the president after Aquino. And during this time, like I said, over 11 tons of gold were shipped to the United States. In order for the golden Buddha to go through to say Marcos had this money, because Marcos only had $5,000, there's no way they could prove it. Marcos came to the United States with 40 crates of gold, 40 crates of personal belongings. Out of the 40 crates, 20 or 32 of them contained Imelda's jewelry. The remaining only had personal papers and everything. There was something like $100 million to $300 million worth of gold bonds, which the United States confiscated. I don't know if it was given back to the Philippines or the United States kept it, but there was over $100 million to $300 million. And so they did an investigation to find out where he got his money. One of the ones was Operation Big Bird. This one was from the Philippines. And they hired several men to go around and find out where the money was. And this was actually under President Joseph Estrada. And the biggest problem is every time they found a big cache of money, say like in Switzerland, the Philippine government would say, oh, there's no evidence of that. There's no evidence of that. And so when they finally found out like $10 billion worth of money, the investigators, these men they hired, Philippine government hired, were charged with financial espionage. Well, what they found was there was 10.6 metric tons of gold were missing from the central bank in the Philippines. That's 10.6 metric tons. And for 4 years, no gold was deposited into the central bank. Now, anywhere from 4 to 20 tons of gold are mined in the Philippines every year. So what I'm saying is, for 4 years, there's none. So Marcos could have probably or possibly taken upwards of 80 tons of gold right there, just disappeared. And then you had 10.6 metric tons also missing, so that could be up to 90 tons. And then 7 more tons were actually stolen from the national banks. And then they have bribes and kickbacks. They found out Marcos had a big network. Basically, there was a thing called the Laurel Act, and this act expired in the early 1970s. And basically what it said was if you owned a business in the Philippines, it had to be 60% Philippine owned. So Ferdinand Marcos wanted to be the owner of all these businesses. So a lot of big businesses, foreign businesses, you name it, that came into the Philippines, Marcos was part owner. It may not have been on paper, but it was known that he was part owner of the business. 2 of the big ones were Philippine Airlines and Asia Breweries. And they were giving Marcos upwards of $30-40 million a year. So 30-40. So you figure for what, 16, 26, about 26 years, he was making $50 million a year. That's $1 billion right there. Many businesses were giving him upwards of $20 million. And then Imelda was in charge of several agencies in Manila to help improve the living standards of Filipinos. And her $2 billion, or however money, I think $200 million, all the money that she was given to oversee this committee, that disappeared. It was gone. No accounting, nothing. It all just disappeared. She actually also was in charge of restoration in the forest because Philippines is known for its woodwork. And it winds up that the Philippine forests were almost depleted because she was selling the wood out. So over the kickbacks over a 9-year period would have been almost $500 million. So that's where he found a whole bunch more. So like I said, there was 4 to 20 tons of gold mined in the Philippines, but 4 years, absolutely nothing. So he could have took upwards 80 million plus the 10 million, the 10 tons. So we're talking up to 90 tons of gold. 3 tons were stolen from Henry Rojas, so 93, and this 7. It's 100 tons of gold. That's 100 tons of gold. And if that's $800 each, that's billions of dollars. And then when it shot up to 1,200, it wound up showing more. So right after the revolution, there was an investigation into Malacayan Palace, and they were knocking on walls, trying to find false walls, trying to find where anything they could find. And they turned around and found a false room in one of the bedrooms. I think it was Imelda's room or Ferdinand Marcos's room. And they turned around and discovered that there was a lot of papers that showed his bank account numbers, where the money was, the fake names, Jane Ryan for Imelda, I think it was William Saunders for Marcos, and the bank accounts added up to over $10 billion. So during the Marcos era of the 30 years so he was president, or 28 years, he stole upwards of $10 billion. And then, this is the most bizarre one of all. So one of the most bizarre part of the investigation was Irene, one of the daughters, was planning to transfer $13 billion out of a German bank account. So the bank actually contacted the Philippine government and said, this is what's happening. They provided the letter that she wrote to the bank saying she wanted to make the transfer. They provided the bank account number, the bank name, photograph of her at the bank making the transfer, and the Philippine government under Joseph Estrada said, what evidence? We didn't see any evidence. It never happened. So there was some kind of protection for the Marcoses after the revolution happened. So there was a lot of people being paid off. But one of the most interesting, now this is where I believe there was gold in the 1940s and the 1950s up into the 60s. I do believe there was some caches of gold there. There may have been 20, may have been 30, 40, but I don't believe it was 175. There was a guy named Santa Romana, and he was a Filipino typesetter who died in the 70s with over $1 billion in a bank account. $1 billion. So this Santa Romana guy was actually one of the richest men in the world, and no one knew who he was. And still to this day, no one knows where he got his money from. There's speculation that he worked for the CIA, the Vatican Underground, or even Ferdinand Marcos himself. So some people believe that he actually had bank account money from Ferdinand Marcos, and other people believe that the Black Eagle Trust Fund, he worked for the Black Eagle Trust Fund, and he tortured Yamashita's driver to locate 12 to 25 locations of gold. And this money, that gold that was found in these different various locations, were put into bank accounts for the CIA to use. And he worked with Lansdale, who wound up becoming the CIA director under Eisenhower, who was fired under Kennedy and started working the Black Eagle Trust Fund as a subcontractor with the CIA. But no one knows how to. With the Marcos, they believe Marcos may have given him money, or Marcos blackmailed him, or he had power of attorney over the bank accounts, and winds up that he was killed. The Vatican Underground is a theory. So there's a lot of theories as how Marcos got his money and if Yamashita's treasure is real. So remember, Marcos started transferring money out in the 1970s, so he's been doing it a long time. And he stated, yeah, I got the money from Yamashita's gold in the 1970s in order to compensate or to cover why he was having so much money he was wiring out.